Lord Peter Wimsey, having survived 1 war, 3 opera premieres, and an uncomfortable luncheon with his sister's latest enthusiasm, a man who had opinions about Yeats and chafing dishes, had thought himself thoroughly inoculated against. Surprised it was therefore something of a personal affront when, upon his arrival at the stolidly respectable village of Chipping Wold in Gloucestershire, he was greeted not with the intended repose of trout streams and rustic cream teas, but by the sight of a valet, pale and muttering, sprinting across the gravel drive of Sollowden Hall, and colliding at full tilt with Wimsey's motor. "Steady." "On Bunter?" murmured Lord Peter, though it was not Bunter at the wheel, but himself. He leaned out of the Hispano-Suiza with mild curiosity. "Has someone mislaid a corpse already, or is it merely the gardener being beastly to the begonias?" The valet weeded, trembling and quite soaked, despite the day's dry sun-blinked, made a choking sound, and fell into the hedge dot by the time Bunter had extricated the unfortunate fellow and administered brandy with the unflappable efficiency of one who has done this before. Naples, 1922, and the business with the poisoned grappa, the butler of Sollowden. Mr. Underhill, a man composed entirely of vertical lines and faint disdain, had arrived to explain. "I regret, my lord, that your visit coincides with something of an unexpected development." "Oh?" said Lord Peter, stepping lightly over the prone valet, who was now snoring gently. "Not another guest eloping with the fish-knife collection, I hope?" "There has been a death, my lord." Wimsey sighed with gentle melancholy, as one might at discovering the pheasant to be slightly overdone. "Well, well, the trout shall have to wait, do tell." Mr. Felix Winterbourne, one of the house guests, found early this morning in the East Library, most regrettably deceased. Natural causes? There is, alas, a rather large bust of Homer involved. It appears to have done its job all too well. Wimsey looked up at the gray, stone-faced manor that loomed above them with unconvincing innocence. Ivy-stained glass and those charming Tudor bits one suspected were glued on in the 1880s. "Homer?" he repeated. "The blind poet or the yellow one?" Mr. Underhill did not blink. "A Greek, my lord, Marple. Rather heavy." Wimsey brightened. "Well, that's the tone set, isn't it? Nothing like classical murder to season a country weekend." He waved a hand toward the open door. "Lead on, Mr. Underhill. I shall delay my fishing and take a squint at your impromptu Iliad. And perhaps," he added thoughtfully, "you'd be so good as to fetch the guest list. There's nothing like knowing who one is meant to suspect before one begins making unfair assumptions about them." "Very good, my lord. And do send word to the local constabulary that I've tripped over another death," he added, stepping into the echoing hall, where ancestral portraits frowned down as if disappointed in his tie. "One hates to be greedy, but I can't resist a murder with classical overtones and bad plumbing. It's so rarely done well." As the butler glided away and Bunter discreetly removed the valet to a settee, Wimsey turned to regard the drawing. Room. A fire crackled, despite it being June. A Persian cat dozed with malicious dignity, and a maid attempted to appear invisible. There was something cloyingly floral in the air lavender, possibly, or deceit. On the mantelpiece, a photograph of the deceased smiled out with the smug serenity of one who has either solved life or misfiled his secrets. "I say," Wimsey murmured half to himself, What a very singular expression for a man who's about to be clobbered with a blind poet. He took out his monocle, polished it against his tie, and turned to Bunter. Keep an ear to the servants, Bunter. They're usually better than the newspapers, and at least they get the weather right. I'll begin with the family, such as it is. One rather hopes there's a nephew in debt or a spiritualist aunt with unusually strong wrists. Very good. My lord, Bunter murmured. Lord Peter straightened his shoulders, glanced once more at the brooding oil portraits, and walked with irrepressible insouciance toward the library, where murder, no doubt, waited in a deeply upholstered chair. East Library, as Lord Peter Wimsey might have expected, was more a tribute to affectation than to scholarship. The shelves were indeed stocked, but with the sort of volumes that suggested someone had ordered one of each from the Times Literary Supplement and left it at that. Greek tragedians rubbed shoulders with Victorian cookery. A leather bound. Tacitus slouched drunkenly beside the modern poulterer's companion. The windows, tall and half-curtained, gave a greenish cast to the light, and dust hung in the air with the sulky defiance of a house that hadn't been truly aired in decades. Dot, in the center of the room, sprawled with almost theatrical deliberation, lay the late Mr. Felix Winterbourne. He was a man in late middle age, gray at the temples, with the narrow, slightly petulant mouth of a man who had once been handsome, and still thought it a relevant consideration. His head lay at an angle that would have suggested sleep, had it not been for the marble bust resting, rather like a hat, atop the flattened ruin of his skull. A small spray of blood had fanned out across the Persian rug like a watercolorist. Testing vermilion, Wimsey leaned forward with interest. It's not often one sees Homer deployed with such enthusiasm. I suppose it rules out suicide. Mr. Underhill, who had entered behind him with the decorous silence of the terminally unimpressed, merely inclined his head. As you say, my lord, Dr. Penfold, he attends the hall from the village, pronounced. Life extinct at precisely 7:15 this morning. The body has not been moved. And the rest of the household? They have been gathered in the small morning-room. Lady Chevenix, of course, is quite overcome. Chevenix? Wimsey looked up sharply. As in Chevenix Hall, Wiltshire? The very same, my lord. Lady Agatha married Colonel Charles Chevenix, now deceased, and inherited the estate some years ago. Saladin is her late father's property. She summers here with her niece and a number of guests. Charming. Wimsey straightened. And Mr. Winterbourne? Who was he when he was at home and unacquainted with ancient poets? Mr. Underhill hesitated. A relatively new acquaintance of Lady Agatha's, appeared rather suddenly 2 weeks ago. He was ... received. Wimsey raised an eyebrow. As in, vouched for? Lady Agatha considered him delightful. He had the air of a man with connections. A Mr. de Lafert of the Foreign Office was mentioned? Yes, de Lafert would get a mudlark into a drawing-room if it quoted Horace. He was attentive to Lady Agatha's niece. Ah, Wimsey's. Mouth curved into a small smile. There is usually a niece. And what precisely was Mr. Winterbourne doing alone in the library this morning? Reading or rising? Uncertain, my lord. Lady Agatha informs me she breakfasted alone in her room. Miss Margaret, that is, the niece, was riding at 6, and the rest of the guests claim to have remained in their rooms. It was the maid, Elsie, who discovered the body when she brought in the post at 7:30. And no one heard anything? No cries, no Homeric thuds. None reported. Whimsy considered this. Very obliging of the murderer. He moved closer to the bust and crouched. No fingerprints, I suppose? The inspector from Morton in Marsh will be along presently. I instructed the staff to touch nothing. Good man. Whimsy studied the dead man's face with something approaching fondness. Odd expression. Almost as though he saw it coming, but didn't believe it. Indeed. And this bust, surely it was from that alcove over there? He gestured to an empty niche between the shelves, its pedestal now bare. Yes, my lord, no sign of disturbance. It was a popular jest of Mr. Winterbourne's to say he preferred Homer to Hardy, and thus gave him pride of place. I wonder, murmured Whimsy, if Homer returned the compliment. He stood, brushing dust from his knees. Let's go and see the others, shall we? There's something about a well-ordered house that turns everyone into inadvertent tragedians. The small morning room was, by contrast, sunny and offensively serene. It smelled of roses and milky tea. The maid had evidently been sent around to distribute cups and distraction. 3 people sat in varying degrees of agitation. A handsome young woman in riding clothes, booted and unsmudged. A man of about 35 with a financier's jaw and a lawyer's eyes, and an elderly lady swathed in mauve, who clutched a lace handkerchief with the indignant despair of one personally insulted by fate. I say, Whimsy began with an amiable drawl, sorry to intrude on such a lovely domestic tableau, but one of your guests seems to have mislaid his brains. May I? Lady Agatha Chevenix drew herself upright, the lace handkerchief fluttering. Lord Peter Whimsy, you're Gerald's brother, are you not? Only on weekdays. May I extend my deepest condolences and perhaps be permitted to intrude most inconveniently for a few questions? She gave the sort of regal nod that indicated permission, granted against better judgment. This, she said with a vague wave, is my niece, Margaret Mountjoy. The young woman nodded, tight-lipped. There was color in her cheeks, not entirely attributable to exercise, and Mr. Lionel Groves, my late husband's solicitor. Only peripherally, murmured Mr. Groves, but I was staying the weekend at Lady Chevenix's invitation. Delighted, said Whimsy, settling into an armchair with feline grace. Now, Miss Mountjoy, you were riding this morning? Yes. From 6 o'clock I took Banquo out over the East Ridge. Banquo? My let's hope she doesn't come back as a ghost. And you saw no one? No. She paused. Except Mr. Groves. On the stairs, Whimsy turned. Indeed? I came down early, Groves said calmly, about 6:30. I wanted some air and went out through the conservatory. We passed each other on the stairs, she going down, I going up. Which floor is your room on? First, south wing. And Mr. Winterbourne? Second floor, west. Ah, nicely symmetrical. Whimsy turned to Lady Agatha. What can you tell me of Mr. Winterbourne's recent habits? Had he enemies, outstanding debts, enthusiastic creditors? She sniffed. He was perfectly agreeable. I only met him twice before this visit, but he came recommended. He was interested in, well, everything. Literature, politics, architecture. And your niece? Lady Agatha bristled. Mr. Winterbourne was attentive. Nothing more. Miss Mountjoy spoke suddenly. He asked me to marry him yesterday afternoon. Whimsy blinked. How very precipitous. And your answer? I said I would think about it. But you hadn't thought by this morning? I hadn't, she said, chin high. And I certainly didn't kill him. Well, said Wimsey cheerfully, one can hardly blame a girl for indecision. I believe Helen of Troy had quite the same difficulty. He rose. If you'll forgive me, I should like to speak with the maid who found the body, and perhaps have a look at Mr. Winterbourne's room. Lady Agatha gave a weary gesture. Take what steps you must. Oh, I always do, said Wimsey, and usually in the wrong shoes. Outside in the corridor, Bunter was already waiting. The maid, Elsie Green, my lord. She's in the scullery. I took the liberty of separating her from the others. She seemed unsettled. Excellent instinct, Bunter. She also let slip something rather curious. Oh? She mentioned seeing Mr. Winterbourne return to the house at 10:30 last night alone, by the garden entrance. And yet, Bunter paused. Lady Agatha swore he was playing whist with the party until nearly midnight. Wimsey's eyes lit? Did she indeed? That's a pity, for whist is such a brutal alibi. He took out his notebook. Come, Bunter. Let us hear what else the staff did not see. Suspicion, like a scent beneath perfume, was beginning to rise. Elsie Green sat in the scullery corner as Wimsey entered, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes downcast but wary. The faint clatter of dishes from the adjoining kitchen did little to mask the stillness in her demeanor. She was a young woman with the pallor of someone unused to excitement of any kind, much less that of a violent death and its attendant inquiries. Miss Green, Wimsey began gently, I trust. You are not too distressed? She blinked up at him. I suppose not, sir. It's just a shock, really. Understandable, he inclined his head. You were the first to find Mr. Winterbourne's body? Yes, sir. I was bringing in the morning post. I always go in early before the others are stirring, to avoid disturbing Lady Chevenix. Quite considerate of you. Wimsey's eyes narrowed slightly. Tell me, when you found him, was there anything unusual about the room or the body? She hesitated, then nodded. Well, sir, the bust was on the floor near his head. But what struck me was the clock on the mantelpiece. It wasn't chiming properly. Wimsey looked sharply toward the mantelpiece, where an ornate French clock stood, its face gleaming under the morning light. The clock? Yes, sir. When I came in at 7:30, I thought it strange that the clock's hands were stuck. At 11:10, a stuck clock. Curious. Wimsey jotted this down. And what about the other clocks in the house? Did you notice anything odd? Elsie wrinkled her brow. I'm not sure, sir. I don't usually pay much attention. Of course. But you did say Mr. Winterbourne returned to the house last night? Yes, sir. I saw him come in through the garden door at about 10:30. Alone? Yes, sir. He looked tired and was carrying a small bag. Did you see anyone else around at that hour? No, sir. The grounds were quiet. Wimsey nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Miss Green. You have been most helpful. As he left the scullery, Bunter fell into step beside him, whispering, That bag, did anyone else mention it? Nothing yet, Wimsey murmured, but it's an intriguing detail. A man arriving late with a bag, when everyone insists he was at cards until midnight. It smells of deception. Together they made their way to Mr. Winterbourne's room, a neat chamber overlooking the western wing gardens. The room was orderly, with books piled on the writing desk, a dressing gown hanging on the door, and the faint aroma of tobacco. Whimsy's gaze drifted to the window, slightly ajar despite the cool morning air. He tapped the glass lightly. Open windows are poor companions for secrets. Bunter approached the desk and picked up a small leather case. Whimsy examined its contents, a collection of passports, foreign currency, and a sheaf of letters bearing foreign stamps. Travel? Whimsy mused aloud. Indeed, Bunter said, and quite frequent, by the look of these. Whimsy sifted through the letters. One caught his eye, a letter from a law firm in London, dated 6 days prior, referencing an inheritance. Ah, Whimsy said, a gentleman with business in town, or perhaps someone to whom business is owed. He glanced again at the passports, noting different names, slight variations of identity. Mr. Winterbourne, it seems, was a man of many faces. Perhaps, Bunter remarked, he was running from something, or someone. Whimsy pocketed the letters. Or to something. He turned toward the door, then paused. Bunter, make discreet inquiries among the local post office and police. See if this gentleman has been traveling under different names. As you wish, my lord. Outside the room the household was stirring, though the atmosphere remained thick with unease. Whimsy made his way to the servants' hall, where he found Elsie's colleague, a tall, stoic footman named Collins. The man greeted Whimsy with a guarded nod. Mr. Collins, I hear you were on duty last night? Yes, my lord, I was. Did you notice anything out of the ordinary? Visitors, noises, strangers lurking in the grounds? Collins shook his head. Nothing, sir. The house was quiet after 10. Quiet, but not silent. Did you hear the clocks chime? Collins frowned. The hall clock struck 11, as usual. But the library clock was quiet. Ah? Whimsy steepled his fingers. An interesting discrepancy. And the servants' movements, were any of you in the vicinity of the east wing between 10 and midnight? No, my lord. We were all accounted for. Miss Elsie was clearing the Morning Post at the time. Whimsy nodded. Thank you. Your honesty is appreciated. Leaving Collins, Whimsy's mind circled the oddities accumulating. A stopped clock, a guest who returned after hours carrying a bag, contradictory alibis, and now multiple passports under different names. The air of genteel innocence was becoming distinctly claustrophobic. He returned to the drawing-room where Lady Chevenix and her niece were speaking in low tones. Mr. Groves sat with fingers steepled, eyes flickering with what Whimsy could only call the lawyer's amusement, that curious blend of detachment and readiness to exploit the smallest misstep. I wonder, Whimsy said aloud, if we might re-examine the timeline. Miss Mountjoy, you were out riding at 6 o'clock and did not return until 7:30, she replied. I took Banchu back to the stables and went straight to my room. And Mr. Groves, you passed Miss Mountjoy at 6:30, going upstairs? Precisely. And Lady Chevenix, you breakfasted alone? Yes. I retired early last night. Whimsy's gaze sharpened. Yet Mr. Winterbourne was supposedly at cards until midnight, despite being seen entering the grounds at 10:30. Lady Chevenix's eyes flickered, then fixed with polite firmness on Whimsy. I assure you, Lord Peter, the evening was perfectly ordinary, indeed. Whimsy clasped his hands. But if the time of death is 7:30, Then Mr. Winterbourne was very much alive when he returned at 10:30. A faint color rose in Miss Mountjoy's cheeks. That cannot be. Unless, Whimsy suggested softly, someone has been very careful to mislead us all. A knock interrupted the conversation. Mr. Underhill entered, carrying a telegram. Whimsy took it and read. Inspector Blakely, Morton in Marsh. Arriving this afternoon. Ah, the law, Whimsy said. Always a pleasure, even if one sometimes prefers to avoid it. Bunter returned with news of his own. My lord, I have learned that Mr. Winterbourne had once been known as Mr. Felix Carmichael. The change of name is recent, and the reasons are ... curious. Whimsy smiled thinly. Curious indeed. The plot thickens. He turned to Lady Chevenix. May I request access to the guest book? There may be visitors we have yet to meet. She nodded, rising with the grace of one who carries a history heavy enough to bend a lesser spine. The book lay on a silver tray in the hall, its leather cracked with age. Whimsy's fingers traced the names with a practised eye. Aside from the household and known guests, there were 2 unfamiliar signatures dated the previous week, a Charles de la Forde and a Dr. Julian Cresswell. The former rings a bell, Whimsy mused. Mr. de Laford, you say? From the Foreign Office, perhaps? Indeed, Lady Chevenix said. He was a friend of Mr. Winterbourne's, or so I was told. And Dr. Cresswell? An acquaintance of Margaret's, a rather reclusive man obsessed with local folklore and— She hesitated. The occult. Whimsy smiled. Occult, you say? Fascinating, but I fear our solutions will be more prosaic. And why the elaborate facade of identity? Whimsy lit his pipe, the amber glow illuminating a face carved with subtle amusement and relentless calculation. Tomorrow, he decided, would be a day for unmasking masks and confronting truths long buried. For beneath the veneer of Saladin's genteel calm lurked a web of secrets that only the sharpest intellect might unravel, and only with the patient disentangling of time, motive, and the human heart. The following morning, the light filtering through the heavy drapes of Saladin's drawing-room carried with it a crispness that suggested both renewal and cold calculation. Lord Peter Whimsy, accompanied by his ever-dutiful Bunter, set about the day's inquiries with that serene patience of a man who sees the invisible strings connecting seemingly disconnected events. After breakfast, he summoned the household to a gathering in the grand hall, not quite a confrontation, but a subtle demonstration that the wheels of his intellect were turning ever faster. Madam, he began, addressing Lady Chevenix with a courteous bow, if you would be so kind as to recount for us the events of the morning following Mr. Winterbourne's demise, particularly the arrival of guests, the timings of the breakfast preparations, and any unusual occurrences. Lady Chevenix's lips pressed into a thin line, but she complied, outlining the sequence with a precision that bordered on defensiveness. The cook, Mrs. Eldridge, arrived at 6:30 to begin preparations, followed by the butler, Mr. Hadley, at 7. Our guests, Mr. de Laford and Dr. Cresswell, had left the previous evening and morning, respectively. Breakfast was served promptly at 8, and the household gathered in the dining-room. Nothing out of the ordinary was noted until the discovery of the body. Whimsy's gaze lingered on the butler, who stood motionless by the door, his face an inscrutable mask. Mr. Hadley, might I impose upon you to share your account? The butler nodded stiffly. Certainly, my lord. I arrived early as usual and assisted Mrs. Eldridge with the service. All doors were secured. I confirmed the windows in Mr. Winterbourne's study were closed the night before. Nothing unusual was noted. And the study itself? Whimsy. Pressed. Any signs of disturbance? The furniture was slightly displaced, sir. A chair knocked over, papers scattered, though I attributed this to the posthumous disarray. Whimsy's eyes narrowed slightly. But you noticed the chair overturned. Was it out of place in a way that suggested haste or struggle? Hadley hesitated, then nodded. Yes, my lord. It was toppled to the left, as if pushed abruptly. Thank you. These details are most illuminating. Turning next to Miss Mountjoy, Whimsy noted the faint tremor in her hands. Miss Mountjoy, you mentioned the study door was locked when the body was found? Yes, Lord Peter. The key was in Mr. Hadley's possession. Was the key used to enter or merely to confirm the room's status? I was not present for the entry, my lord, but it was said to be locked when the room was discovered. A locked door, a toppled chair, and a shattered time-mine, Whimsy murmured. Curious how these mundane particulars gather into a tapestry of enigma. As the morning progressed, Whimsy and Bunter visited the servants' quarters, where whispered conversations and downcast eyes revealed a web of loyalties and fears. The housemaid, Elsie, was especially forthcoming, albeit nervous. I swear, my lord, I saw Mr. Groves near the study late that evening, she confessed, ringing. Her hands. He was pacing, muttering about debts and inheritance. It gave me quite a fright. Whimsy noted the detail with interest. Did anyone else see Mr. Groves at that hour? Only me, sir. The others were preparing for the guest's departure. Thank you, Elsie. Your courage in speaking plainly is commendable. Later, Whimsy requested to examine the study once more, this time with Bunter close behind. The afternoon light spilled over the disorder. Papers strewn across the oak desk, a small silver salver missing from its usual place, and the bust of Homer itself now placed more deliberately on a side table, as if to conceal something. Whimsy's fingers traced the edge of the desk. This disarray is too methodical for a mere struggle. Someone wanted it to appear chaotic. He pulled open a drawer, revealing a half-burned letter, the remnants hinting at a demand for repayment or threat. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but angry. Financial pressures, Whimsy mused. Yet motives extend beyond the ledger. Nearby, Bunter found a fragment of a torn photograph wedged beneath the rug. A lady's face partially obscured, he noted. Another piece of the puzzle, Whimsy said, carefully bagging the fragment. The pattern of deception deepened when they visited the village post office, where a clerk remembered Mr. Winterbourne's correspondence with a mysterious correspondent addressed simply as M. The timeline sharpened as Whimsy cross-referenced arrival and departure times of visitors, servants' shifts, and Winterbourne's last known movements. Discrepancies appeared, the hall clocks chiming at 11, yet the dining-room clock remaining silent. The butler's statement that all windows were secured contradicted by Elsie's claim of a slightly ajar sash. Subtle manipulation of time and place, Whimsy remarked. A puzzle wrapped in the guise of civility. The day's interviews revealed no smoking gun, but several simmering tensions. Groves's financial desperation, Lady Chevenix's evasions, and the doctor's cryptic allusions to past secrets formed a triangulation of suspicion. By evening, Whimsy stood once more In the drawing-room, his sharp eyes sweeping over the gathered household. "It is often said that murder is the sincerest form of conversation," he said lightly, though in this house it appears to be a rather overwrought soliloquy. His glance rested briefly on Groves, who shifted uneasily. "The question," Wimsey continued, "is not who had the opportunity, but who felt the necessity." He puffed on his pipe, the smoke curling upward like the tendrils of mystery itself. "In time, the truth will emerge not from what is shouted, but from what is whispered between the lines." The household exchanged uneasy glances, the night thickening with unspoken fears, and somewhere in the shadows of Salloden Hall, the answer awaited, patient, concealed, and far more human than any ghost story could reveal. The morning air at Salloden was crisp with the faint scent of damp earth and last night's smoke lingering in the hearths. It was a day whose quiet promised little, but was destined, as always with Lord Peter Wimsey's investigations, to unfurl layers of complexity beneath the veneer of calm. Peter found himself awake early, restless not for the discomfort of the chill, but for the simmering puzzle that refused to be settled by mere testimonies and scattered clues. Breakfast was a subdued affair, the usual chatter dampened by the gravity. Hanging over the household like a pall, Lady Chevenix sat with her back rigid against her chair, eyes darting beneath heavy lids, while Mr. Groves maintained an immobility that seemed less resignation than calculation. Wimsey's glance briefly met theirs, a silent query conveyed with the faintest lift of an eyebrow. Bunter, ever the epitome of unflappable competence, handed Wimsey a small notebook. "A visitor arrived earlier, my lord. One Miss Penelope Hargrave, who claims to have known Mr. Winterbourne in London. Quite insisted on seeing you." Peter's lips twitched, amused at the notion of yet another player stepping onto the stage. "Miss Hargrave, you say? London acquaintance, you say? Let us see whether her arrival will illuminate the murk or merely scatter the shadows further." Miss Hargrave was ushered in shortly thereafter, a woman of striking presence, neither youthful nor old, with a demeanor that balanced between delicate refinement and an undercurrent of steel. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, flicked over the assembled household before settling on Wimsey. "Lord Peter," she began, her voice low and measured, "I feared I would be too late. Your presence here is a comfort. I knew Lionel Winterbourne better than most." Peter inclined his head. "Indeed, Miss Hargrave. Pray, elucidate your acquaintance with the late Mr. Winterbourne. I find each thread in this tangled web a necessity. To grasp the whole." She sighed, a faint shadow passing across her features. "We met in London some years ago when he was still living under his original name, Lionel Harrington. It was a different life then, one he tried desperately to leave behind. He was running from debts and a rather unsavory past, tangled with people best forgotten." Wimsey's interest piqued. "A change of name, then? An attempt at reinvention. Did you, perchance, see evidence of this past catching up with him?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, he spoke often of a man named Thurlow, a creditor, and something. Of a blackmailer. Winterbourne feared exposure and ruin. When he adopted the Chevenix estate and identity, he hoped the sea, air, and distance would protect him." "Thurlow," Wimsey mused aloud, tapping his chin. "The name does not yet appear. In any local inquiries, have you come directly from London?" "Yes, but I delayed in coming. I had hoped to handle things discreetly to protect his new life. But the telegram reached me last night. He is dead, and this house is in chaos. The household's collective." Tension tightened. Even Lady Chevenix, who had remained silent, now shifted uneasily. Wimsey perceived, beneath the surface civility, a chasm of secrets. "Miss Hargrave," Wimsey said kindly, "your arrival is fortuitous. Might you furnish any correspondence or documents relating to this Mr. Thurlow, or any indication of recent communications between him and the deceased?" "I have a letter," she replied, producing a folded sheet from her reticule, "found in my luggage. I fear it may be the last note Lionel wrote before his death." Peter unfolded the letter with the reverence due an ancient manuscript. The handwriting was indeed agitated, the words hinting at imminent danger and pleading for secrecy. The letter referred cryptically to the gathering storm and implored the recipient to meet at the Old Quay before the tide changes. "Old Quay," Wimsey murmured. "A locality known for its solitude and more than one unfortunate history. Bunter, might you accompany me to inspect this place at once? There may be something overlooked." Miss Hargrave was invited to join, and after a quick exchange with the household staff, the trio set off in the late morning sun toward the coast. The journey was brief, the winding lanes of the village giving way to the crumbling stone and salt-sprayed wood of the quay. The scene was bleak yet haunting, a scattering of rusted mooring posts, a small boat tethered loosely to a cleat, and the relentless sea, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding on its edge. Wimsey's keen eyes scanned the area, noting footprints muddled in the sand, some fresh, others partially washed away by the tide. There was evidence of a recent struggle, a torn scrap of cloth caught on a jagged rock, and the faint impression of a scuffle near the waterline. "Miss Hargrave, do you recognize this place from your knowledge of Mr. Winterbourne's activities?" She hesitated. He mentioned at once a secret meeting spot for matters he dared not discuss elsewhere. Peter stooped to examine the torn cloth, its fabric finer than one would expect of a common fisherman's garment, silk or fine wool. "Perhaps curious," he said, "that such a place of solitude should be the stage for a clandestine meeting. Yet it bears all the hallmarks of a rendezvous steeped in urgency and fear." He paced the stones, matching the footprints to known sizes and gait. "These prints here," he pointed, "belong to a man of lighter build, but these other prints," he continued, indicating a broader, heavier tread, "belong to someone else entirely. Two parties were present, no doubt the writer of the letter and his visitor. The pair shared a glance that spoke volumes. This meeting, clandestine and desperate, might well be the thread from which the entire tapestry unraveled. Returning to Saladin, Wimsey's mind raced. If Lionel Winterbourne was being pressured by a figure from his past, someone with the ability and will to threaten his new identity, the murderer might well be more than a household acquaintance or local creditor. The layers of disguise and subterfuge thickened. Why had no one in the village heard of this Thurlow? Was the man simply absent, or was he hiding in plain sight? Wimsey convened the household once more. "There is a matter of a visitor from the past who may have had sufficient motive to see Mr. Winterbourne silenced," he began, eyes sweeping over the assembly. "Miss Hargrave has enlightened us to a dimension hitherto unconsidered, one of debts, threats, and shadows from London." Mr. Grove shifted in his seat, brow furrowed. "If you mean to suggest the killer is not among us, Lord Peter, I fear the village is safe no longer." "Not necessarily," Whimsy replied gently. "The threat could be close, even intimate, masked by friendship or loyalty. The key to the murderer lies not in the grand gestures, but in the overlooked detail." He paused, lighting a cigar, the smoke curling like an unspoken clue. "I must delve deeper into Mr. Winterbourne's London past and the mysterious Thurlow. Meanwhile, every word, every glance within these walls may be a cipher waiting to be decoded." The household exchanged wary glances, understanding that the calm was but a fragile veneer. The game was far from over, and Lord Peter's pursuit of truth was only just beginning to illuminate the darkness that lay beneath. Saladin's genteel surface, the quiet of the afternoon, settled heavily upon Saladin, as if the house itself were holding its breath, awaiting the slow, inevitable peeling away of its secrets. Lord Peter Whimsy found himself in the small study where the late Lionel Winterbourne had often been said to retire, now a repository of scattered papers, a single lit lamp casting long shadows against the polished wood. The letter from Miss Hargrave rested on the desk before him, its cryptic references nagging at his intellect like an unresolved motif in a Beethoven sonata. Bunter had just returned from the village, bringing with him the latest local gossip and a small bundle of letters that had arrived addressed to Winterbourne before his death. It was an ordinary batch on the surface, but Whimsy knew well that in such seemingly mundane correspondence could lie the key to unlocking a labyrinthine mystery. "Curious," Whimsy murmured, sifting through the envelopes. One in particular bore a foreign postmark, Paris. He broke the seal carefully. The handwriting was florid, almost theatrical, and the words were suffused with a tone of familiarity and veiled threat. "My dear Lionel," it began, "you may have buried the past beneath the English soil, but shadows stretch long and stubborn. The debts are not merely financial. You owe a reckoning, and I intend to collect." Whimsy's eyes narrowed. A man who writes from Paris, yet whose reach extends to a quiet English estate. This Thurlow is a player who knows no bounds. Miss Hargrave, who had been lingering near the doorway, stepped forward. "That letter came after the one I brought. It confirms my suspicion. Winterbourne was not simply a man fleeing debts, but was ensnared in a game with a ruthless opponent." Whimsy tapped the desk with the stub of his cigar. "Indeed. And yet we must ask, why did Winterbourne not confide in his closest companions? Or were those companions not so close after all?" He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room. "The answer may lie in the inconsistencies of the household's own testimonies. If the killer is among us, then their careful mask might be cracking under the pressure of investigation." The study door creaked open, admitting Lady Chevenix, her face pale but determined. "Lord Peter," she began, "there is something. You should know something I hesitated to reveal earlier. Lionel's behavior changed markedly in the weeks before his death. He was often withdrawn, sometimes restless at night, pacing the corridors as though haunted." "Haunted indeed, Lady Chevenix," Whimsy replied dryly, "though the hauntings in this tale are surely of a very earthly nature." She continued, "He spoke one evening of a visitor in the dark, though I assumed it to be metaphorical. Now, I am not so sure." Peter's mind spun the threads together. A visitor in the dark, a meeting at the old quay, a man named Thurlow, who threatens from afar. The psychological cage in which Winterbourne found himself is tightening. He directed Bunter to fetch the household's account of the night of the murder once again. We must re-examine every movement, every whispered word, and every minute of time. Minutes later, the assembled staff, including Mr. Groves, the butler, and the maid Mary, were once more questioned. Each swore to their innocence and recounted their whereabouts with a mixture of nervousness and conviction. Whimsy's gaze was particularly fixed upon Mr. Groves. The butler's meticulous attention to detail was evident, yet there was a stiffness, a rigidity in his posture which suggested the weight of concealed knowledge. "Mr. Groves," Whimsy said gently, "you mentioned earlier a noise heard around midnight, a disturbance in the hall. Can you specify the nature of this sound?" Groves cleared his throat. It was a sharp, sudden noise like the clatter of a heavy object falling. "I investigated, but found nothing amiss." "And yet," Whimsy pressed, "this was shortly before Winterbourne was discovered. Is it not possible the disturbance was connected?" Groves's eyes flickered, but his expression remained composed. "I can only attest to what I heard, Lord Peter." Peter nodded, filing the detail away. The noise, dismissed as insignificant, might be a vital piece in the puzzle, perhaps a red herring, or a thread leading to the truth. Next, Whimsy turned to Mary, the maid, whose nervous glances betrayed her discomfort. "Mary," Whimsy said softly, "did you notice anything unusual that night? A visitor, a sound, a light where there should have been none?" Mary swallowed hard. "There was a light, my lord, in the west wing corridor, the servants' passage. But I thought it was only Mr. Winterbourne going to his study." And did you see him there?" "No, sir. When I passed the corridor again, the light was out. It was late, and I hurried to my room." Whimsy noted this discrepancy. The light's brief illumination might suggest a secret movement or a clandestine, meeting details easy to overlook but pregnant with significance. Returning to the letter, he pondered the phrase, "before the tide changes." The interplay of tides and timing seemed not merely poetic, but deliberately coded. "Bunter," he said, "we must ascertain the exact times of the tides yesterday. If Winterbourne intended to meet his visitor at a precise moment, it may reveal when the fatal encounter occurred." Bunter returned with the tidal charts within the hour. Whimsy examined them closely. The tide had reached its highest at 11:30 p.m. and began receding thereafter. Then the meeting could only have taken place shortly before or after high tide, he concluded. The sound Mr. Groves heard may well coincide with this time frame. He turned to Miss Hargrave. "Your knowledge of Winterbourne's London past might illuminate the character of this Thurlow. What sort of man are we dealing with?" She answered without hesitation. "Thurlow is a man of influence and brutality. Not merely a creditor, but a man with connections to criminal circles. His letters, I have seen, are veiled threats backed by action." Whimsy smiled wryly. A charming character, then. No wonder. Winterbourne wished to keep his acquaintance hidden from the respectable confines of Saladin. A knock at the door interrupted the gathering. Bunter entered, bearing a bundle of newspapers recently acquired from the nearby town. Whimsy spread them on the desk, eyes scanning the headlines and reports. Among the articles, one headline caught his attention: a report of a recent burglary in London, a house ransacked and documents stolen coincidentally. a property once rented by Winterbourne. He leaned back, tapping his fingers. The past is not dead nor even past, as the bard might. Say the theft of documents from Winterbourne's former lodgings suggests someone was desperate to erase evidence. Perhaps our elusive Mr. Thurlow. Lady Chevenix gasped. Could the documents relate to the estate here? The Chevenix inheritance? Possibly, Whimsy said thoughtfully. Or to matters even more delicate, debts, identities, secrets which, if revealed, would ruin reputations and lives. The household seemed to shrink in on itself, the invisible webs tightening. Peter's mind was already assembling the pieces into an emerging design, each detail, each shadow of the past and present, adding depth to the portrait of a man trapped. Between worlds he stood and moved to the window, gazing out over the gardens where the light was beginning to fade. The tide of human nature, he mused, was just as unpredictable and relentless as that of the sea. Tonight, he declared, we shall test our hypotheses. I shall take watch near the west wing passage. If the murderer is to act again, or if the elusive visitor returns, we shall be ready. Miss Hargrave and Bunter exchanged looks, and the household braced itself for the long hours ahead. The game was no longer theoretical. It had become a matter of presence, of vigilance, and of catching a shadow in the act. The dusk deepened, and as the lamps were lit one by one, Saladin's ancient stones held their breath once more, awaiting the unraveling of the next crucial thread in Lord Peter Wimsey's intricate investigation. The night had settled over Saladin like a velvet curtain, thick and suffocating in its silence. The only light came from the faint glow of the lamps in the main hall and the solitary flicker of a candle in the west wing corridor, where Lord Peter Wimsey now crouched in the shadows behind a heavy tapestry, his keen eyes, accustomed to reading the minutiae of human behavior as easily as lines in a book, scanned the empty passage with clinical precision. Patience, Bunter, he whispered, as the footfalls in the distance slowed to a halt just beyond the doorway of the servants. Passage. A game of shadows is no place for impatience. Bunter, concealed discreetly near the stairwell, gave a silent nod. The butler's years of service to Wimsey had taught him that the smallest detail, be it the shift of a curtain or a misplaced glove, could mean the difference between illumination and obscurity. Suddenly, a figure emerged, stepping carefully into the corridor. A man, tall and cloaked in a heavy overcoat, moved with the careful hesitation of one wary of detection. Wimsey's pulse quickened. The visitor was clearly not part of the household. The gait bespoke a certain unfamiliarity, a deliberate, cautious pacing that bespoke a secretive intent. The man paused near the window, overlooking the gardens, pulling from his coat a small packet wrapped in brown paper. With nimble fingers he extracted a folded sheet of paper and slipped it through the slightly ajar window. The act was quick, practiced, a silent message cast to the outside world. Wimsey's mind raced. The cryptic phrase in the letter, "Before the tide changes," now gained a fuller dimension. The message was not merely sent, but staged, the timing integral. The tides would serve as an unassuming clock, a silent accomplice to clandestine communication. As the figure turned to retreat, a sudden creak from the floorboards betrayed his presence. Wimsey rose silently, emerging from the shadow with a quiet authority that startled the man, who whirled about, a hand instinctively reaching for his coat pocket. "Going somewhere, Mr. Thurlow?" Whimsy's voice was calm, almost amused, but with an unmistakable edge. The man's eyes flickered with surprise, then cold calculation. "Lord Peter Wimsey," he said, voice low and controlled. "I wondered when you would begin to take an interest." "Interest, indeed. Curiosity, mostly. You see, it is rather difficult not to notice a shadow flitting about after dark, especially when it is dealing in secrecy." Thurlow's lip curled into a thin smile. "You have been meddling where you ought not, investigating matters beyond your ken." "And yet here I am," Wimsey replied, stepping closer, "and you are still clutching that packet. Care to share its contents?" A brief hesitation, then Thurlow's fingers slipped the parcel into his coat. "You underestimate the dangers involved." "On the contrary," Wimsey said, "I rather think you underestimate my patience and my resources." For a tense moment the two men regarded each other, a silent duel of wills unfolding in the finite, narrow corridor. Then, with a sudden lurch, Thurlow bolted, dashing toward the main hall. "Bunter," Wimsey called, moving swiftly after him. The chase was brief but tense. Thurlow, though desperate, was no match for the nimble Lord Peter and his loyal retainer. Cornered near the grand staircase, the man halted, breathless, eyes darting for an escape. "Now, Mr. Thurlow," Wimsey said, voice cutting through the charged air, "you might consider surrendering the parcel and explaining your business here." Thurlow's shoulders slumped. "Very well, Lord Peter," he said, reluctantly producing the packet. "But you must understand the contents are dangerous. They pertain to Lionel Winterbourne's past, a past he sought desperately to bury." Wimsey took the parcel, unfolding the brown paper with care. Inside were several letters, photographs, and what appeared to be a ledger, its pages filled with cryptic notations and names, some familiar, others obscure. He scanned the documents, swiftly noting references to London firms, foreign addresses, and a series of coded transactions. The ledger chronicled debts, payments, and threats, weaving a web of financial entanglements that suggested Winterbourne was deeply embroiled in illicit dealings. "Quite the charmer, was he not?" Wimsey remarked, eyes glinting with dry amusement. Thurlow's expression darkened. Winterbourne's debts were only part of the story. He was blackmailed, manipulated, forced to live a double life to protect those he loved. "Ah, now there is a motive worth investigating," Wimsey said. "But before we delve further, there are questions yet unanswered. For instance, how did you come to be involved with him?" Thurlow hesitated, then confessed in a low voice. "I was his creditor, yes, but I was also his keeper of secrets, in a manner of speaking. I demanded repayment not merely of money, but of silence." "And yet," Wimsey said, "you threaten that silence now by your presence here. Quite a paradox." "I am a man trapped by my own bargains," Thurlow admitted bitterly. Winterbourne's death unsettled the delicate balance. Wimsey folded the documents carefully. "And the noise Mr. Groves reported, the disturbance in the hall, does it fit into your narrative?" Thurlow nodded. "It was the moment I confronted Winterbourne. Our argument turned violent. I left before things escalated beyond control." Wimsey's eyes narrowed. "A confession of sorts." Before Thurlow could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. Lady Chevenix and Miss Hargrave appeared, their faces etched with concern. "Is it true, then?" Lady Chevenix asked, voice trembling. "Did you confront Lionel? Was this the cause of his death?" Thurlow met her gaze without flinching. "Yes, Lady Chevenix, but I did not kill him. His death was a tragedy born of fear and desperation, not murder." Whimsy studied the faces before him, the butler, the maid, the widow, and felt the weight of the tangled human emotions behind the ledger's cold numbers. "This evening has confirmed much," he said, voice measured, "but there remains a vital piece missing from the puzzle, a detail overlooked, a seemingly trivial fact that will reveal the true circumstances of Lionel Winterbourne's demise." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "Tomorrow we shall revisit the scene with fresh eyes and renewed purpose. Tonight, however, the house must rest, for even secrets require the balm of sleep before they can be fully understood." As the household dispersed, whispers trailing after them like ghosts, Whimsy remained by the window, watching the moon's silver path across the tide-dark sea. The game was far from over, but the first decisive moves had been made. In the quiet of the night, Lord Peter Wimsey's mind turned over every word, every shadow, preparing to expose the hidden truth lurking just beyond the dawn. The dawn was a pale wash of gray light, filtering through the heavy curtains of Winterbourne Manor as Lord Peter Wimsey strode purposefully into the great hall. The house, still, steeped in the heavy atmosphere of the night's revelations, seemed to exhale a reluctant breath as the household began to stir. Servants bustled quietly, exchanging furtive glances, the weight of suspicion settling on every shoulder like a shroud. Whimsy paused, his eyes catching the glint of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. It was precisely 9 o'clock, an oddity. As he had noted the previous day, the clock had been out of sync by nearly 7 minutes. A trivial detail, perhaps, but in the intricate weave of this case, every anomaly was a thread worth tugging. "Bunter," Whimsy said, nodding to his faithful valet who had accompanied him since their arrival, "the matter of that clock continues to intrigue me. Please have Mr. Groves attend me with the keys to the clock case. I wish to ascertain whether it has been tampered with." While Bunter moved to carry out the instruction, Whimsy's gaze turned towards the wide staircase. The morning's first interview was due Mrs. Groves, the housekeeper, whose reports had thus far been a mixture of rigid propriety and evasive glances. It was time to revisit her testimony with the fresh knowledge gleaned overnight. The housekeeper appeared promptly, her expression guarded yet respectful. Whimsy led her gently but firmly into the library, where the morning light lent an austere clarity to the room. "Mrs. Groves," he began, "thank you for your continued cooperation. Might I trouble you for some further clarifications on last evening's events?" Mrs. Groves nodded, fingers tightening briefly on her handkerchief. "Certainly, Lord Peter." Whimsy folded his hands neatly on the table. "You mentioned hearing a loud argument between Mr. Winterbourne and a gentleman in the West Wing corridor. Could you recall the precise time?" "Just after 8, my lord," she replied, her voice steady. "I was in the kitchen when voices carried through. It was heated, but I could not make out the words." "Indeed," Whimsy mused aloud. "And the clock in the hall, did it chime at the hour?" She hesitated, eyes flickering. "No, my lord. The clock was silent, unusual for it." Whimsy's eyebrows lifted imperceptibly. Curious. Do you recall if the clock was running slow or fast at any other time? No, my lord, I only noticed it was not chiming. Ah, and the windows of the corridor, were any open? Mrs. Groves thought for a moment. The one nearest the garden was ajar, yes. I closed it after hearing the voices grow loud. Thank you, Mrs. Groves. One final question. Was anyone else seen in the corridor that evening? The housekeeper's. Lips pressed tightly. No one, my lord. At least, none that I noticed. With a nod, Whimsy concluded the interview, making a mental note to cross-reference this with the other statements. There was a subtle evasiveness in Mrs. Grove's tone, a measured reluctance to reveal more than necessary. The weight of responsibility she bore was palpable. Before departing, Whimsy glanced towards the mantel clock, now opened by Bunter, who carefully examined the internal mechanism. You see, Bunter, Whimsy murmured, a clock that does not chime at the hour is a clock deliberately silenced. Whoever was in the corridor had ample time to conduct their business undisturbed. Meanwhile, in the drawing-room, Miss Hargrave awaited Whimsy's approach. The widow's pale composure had hardened since the previous night, yet a flicker of anxiety betrayed her usual stoicism. Miss Hargrave, Whimsy greeted with his customary arch smile. May I have a word? She inclined her head, eyes steady, but cautious. Your relationship with Mr. Winterbourne has been described as complicated, Whimsy began. Yet I am curious about one particular detail. You mentioned that on the night of his death you retired early, yet several witnesses claim to have seen you near the library well past midnight. Miss Hargrave's lips parted slightly, a faint flush coloring her cheeks. I was restless. Lord Peter, I needed air, that is all. Indeed, Whimsy replied, folding his hands. Might I ask if you saw anyone else during your nocturnal perambulations? Only the butler, Sir James, she said. He was delivering a message from the cook, I believe. Sir James Groves entered promptly, as if on cue. Whimsy observed the butler's expression, noting the subtle twitch of his jaw. Sir James, Whimsy said, you delivered a message at midnight? Do recall its contents. Groves nodded. Yes, my lord. The cook wished to remind Miss Hargrave that breakfast would be served at 8. A mere formality, really. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. At midnight? The butler's eyes flickered. Yes, my lord. Unusual, perhaps, but the cook is a stickler for punctuality. Curious indeed, Whimsy murmured, filing away the detail. For later consideration, the afternoon unfolded with further interviews. The maidservant who had tidied the West Wing corridor that morning, the local vicar who had arrived unexpectedly late the previous evening, and even the village constable, who had taken the initial report. Each testimony added subtle layers to the tapestry of suspicion and misdirection. A subtle contradiction here, a delayed timeline there, all carefully woven into the fabric of a mystery that refused to unravel, neatly dot, as the day waned. Whimsy retired once more to the library, spreading out the various statements, letters, and photographs. The ledger from Thurlow lay open beside him, its coded entries a silent testimony to Winterbourne's double life. The connection between financial desperation and personal turmoil was evident. Yet as Whimsy studied the ledger, a name caught his attention. M. Locksley, listed several times with sizable transactions. He recalled that neither the widow nor the servants had mentioned this individual. A red herring, perhaps, or a key to the final puzzle. Bunter, Whimsy called softly. "Fetch me the village directory and any recent correspondence from the estate office." Within moments a bundle of letters and the directory were spread before him. Among them was a recent letter addressed to Winterbourne from a Miss Maud Locksley, an elusive name now suddenly very important. The letter itself was terse, hinting at a clandestine meeting and a matter of utmost urgency, yet carefully avoiding specifics. Whimsy's lips curled into a faint smile. "The plot thickens, Bunter. Our elusive Miss Locksley may well hold the missing piece to this vexing puzzle." As twilight deepened, the manor seemed to draw itself inward, shadows lengthening across the walls. Whimsy stood, his mind racing with possibilities, aware that the final revelation drew near one that would cast a stark light on the seemingly benign lives around him. In the quiet that followed, the house whispered its secrets once more, awaiting the moment when logic and human frailty would collide in inevitable, shattering conclusion. The night deepened over Winterbourne Manor, and with it the air thickened heavy with anticipation, secrets, and unspoken fears. Lord Peter Whimsy sat once more in the dim glow of the library's reading lamp, the scattered papers and letters before him forming a tableau of mysteries yet unresolved. The hour was late, and the house had fallen into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the occasional murmur of a restless servant, or the distant tolling of the church bell. Yet beneath this veneer of stillness, the gears of discovery turned swiftly in Whimsy's mind. The elusive Miss Maud Locksley, the cryptic ledger entries, the silenced clock, and the inexplicable behavior of those within the household, all threads, weaving into a pattern, only now beginning to emerge with clarity. Bunter, having returned from his discreet inquiries into Miss Locksley's whereabouts, reported quietly, "She is lodged at the Rose and Crown, Lord Peter." A Miss Maud Locksley, a school-teacher by profession, known for her sharp intellect and reclusive habits. She arrived in the village under somewhat mysterious circumstances without much explanation. "Perfect," Whimsy murmured, rising to don his coat. "It is time we paid a visit to this elusive schoolmarm." The Rose and Crown was a modest establishment on the village's edge, its cheerful sign swaying gently in the night breeze. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of peat smoke and ale, the low murmur of conversation, punctuated by the clinking of glasses. Whimsy's entrance, however, commanded an immediate hush, the regulars casting curious glances toward the tall figure in tweeds and the sharply attired valet at his heels. Miss Locksley was seated alone at a corner table, a book half forgotten in her hands. Her appearance was unassuming, stern features soft only by the flicker of intelligence in her pale blue eyes. She looked up as Whimsy approached, recognition sparking in her gaze. "Lord Peter Whimsy, I presume?" she said crisply, closing the book. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Whimsy inclined his head, the faintest smile playing on his lips. "Miss Locksley, you hold a key to the riddle troubling Winterbourne Manor. Might I trouble you for a conversation in a more private setting?" She considered for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, I imagine discretion is prudent." They moved to a quiet parlor upstairs where the thick curtains muffled the sounds from below. Whimsy wasted no time. "Miss Locksley, your correspondence with the late Mr. Winterbourne was most intriguing. Could you illuminate the nature of your relationship?" A shadow passed over her face, quickly masked by composure. "Mr. Winterbourne was a distant relative, though I doubt he acknowledged it. Our family ties were tangled and fraught with old grievances. I came to Winterbourne at his invitation to discuss matters of inheritance and to remind him of certain obligations. Whimsy nodded, sensing the delicate balance she maintained. Obligations financial, I presume? Yes, she replied, but more than that, a pact, if you will. One made in secrecy, binding both our families to a legacy neither wished to acknowledge publicly. Intriguing as ever, Whimsy allowed the pause to hang, then pressed on. And this pact was at the source of his recent troubles? Miss Locksley sighed. Partly. Mr. Winterbourne was a man burdened by debts and secrets. He feared exposure, yet felt trapped by his own pride. Did he confide in you regarding his enemies? Anyone who might wish him harm? Her eyes narrowed briefly. Enemies are often closer than one suspects. There was one Sir James Groves, the butler, a man of great discretion, but also of considerable ambition. He knew more than he let on. Whimsy's mind raced, piecing together the subtle undercurrents previously overlooked. Sir James Groves, he repeated thoughtfully. You suspect. Him? I merely state facts, Miss Locksley replied, her tone clipped. He was seen near the west wing on the night in question, and his loyalty was ... flexible. The weight of her words settled between them like a dark cloud. Whimsy thanked her and departed swiftly, the gears of deduction now turning faster than ever. Back at Winterbourne Manor, the household was restless. News of Whimsy's visit to Miss Locksley had circulated quietly among the staff, fanning the embers of suspicion. In the great hall, Whimsy summoned Sir James Groves for an immediate audience. The butler arrived promptly, expression composed but with a flicker of unease beneath the veneer. Whimsy's gaze was steady, analytical. Sir James, he began, your movements on the night of Mr. Winterbourne's demise require elucidation. You delivered a message to Miss Hargrave at midnight, did you not? Groves inclined his head. I did, my lord. And yet you were seen near the west wing corridor earlier that evening, near the time of the argument Mrs. Groves overheard? The butler's eyes flickered, a subtle tightening of the jaw. I was performing my duties as instructed. Indeed, duties which, curiously, involved unlocking a side door leading directly to the garden, now locked and sealed since. Sir James hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes, my lord. Whimsy leaned forward, his voice low but incisive. A peculiar detail, Sir James, for that door's lock was recently altered one that only you and the master possessed the keys to. Might I ask why you required access there on that fateful night? The butler's calm fractured, if only momentarily. I sought to retrieve a letter Mr. Winterbourne had left for me to deliver to Miss Hargrave. It was a matter of urgency. Was this letter found? Whimsy inquired. Groves' face paled imperceptibly. No, my lord. It was missing. Missing, Whimsy echoed thoughtfully. Convenient, is it not? The butler said nothing, but his silence was an admission of sorts. Whimsy dismissed him with a courteous nod and turned to Bunter, who had quietly observed the exchange. Prepare to search the butler's quarters thoroughly. I suspect our missing letter lies hidden there. The search yielded a small packet, cleverly concealed beneath the floorboard. Inside were several letters, some in Winterbourne's handwriting, others unsigned, but bearing the same urgent tone. The content hinted at blackmail, threats to reveal long-buried family secrets, and a plan to sever ties irrevocably. The pieces fell into place with a cold precision. Winterbourne's death was not a crime of passion, but a calculated act born from desperation and betrayal. The butler, once the trusted keeper of secrets, had become the orchestrator of ruin. Yet Wimsey sensed another layer, a final stroke that had yet to be uncovered. He called the household together in the drawing-room, where shadows danced on the walls as the flickering fire cast an eerie glow. "My friends," Wimsey began, his voice measured, "we have unraveled much. The silent clock, the locked door, the missing letter all point to a conspiracy of subtle treachery. But the question remains, how was the murder accomplished without detection?" Eyes turned toward him, anticipation taut in the room. "The answer," Wimsey continued, "lies not in the overt, but in the overlooked. The soundproofing of the West Wing corridor, the misaligned clocks, and the seemingly trivial act of closing a window, all part of a carefully staged scene designed to mislead and confuse." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Sir James Groves, your ambition led you to murder, but it was your knowledge of the manor's quirks, the clock's silence, the soundproofing that gave you the illusion of impunity. The letter you sought to hide was your undoing, revealing threats not only against Mr. Winterbourne, but against yourself, should your duplicity be exposed." Groves' face twisted, the mask of control slipping. "You have no proof." He spat Wimsey, smiled thinly. "On the contrary, Sir James, your footprints near the locked door, the timeline discrepancies, and the very letter you attempted to conceal all point directly to you. The evidence is as precise as the manor's clockwork." "The Butler faltered, then slumped into defeat. "I only wanted to protect what was mine, ... The house exhaled with relief and unease. Another secret laid bare, another shadow lifted as dawn broke over Winterbourne Manor. Lord Peter Wimsey prepared to depart. His case, like the manor itself, was a study in the human heart's contradictions, where loyalty could curdle into. Betrayal and the ticking of a clock marked not just the passage of time, but the inexorable approach of truth. With a final glance back at the house and its weary inhabitants, Wimsey remarked dryly to Bunter, "One must always remember, my dear, Bunter, that even the most innocuous clock may tell a story darker than its face reveals." And with that he stepped into the morning mist. The case closed, but the mystery of human nature forever open. The drawing-room was unusually silent as the guests gathered once more under the dim glow of the evening lamps, their faces expectant and tinged with unease. Lord Peter Wimsey, standing with his customary air of genteel impatience, surveyed the assembled company with a faintly sardonic smile. "I do hope you all find yourselves comfortably seated, for tonight the curtain falls on our little drama." There was an almost imperceptible shiver in the air. Whether from the chill outside or the tension within the room, it was difficult to say. The vicar shifted nervously, while Miss Rosamond exchanged glances with her mother, Mrs. Barclay, whose expression was carefully neutral. Even the door butler, Hargreaves, betrayed the slightest twitch of an eyebrow. Wimsey began, "It is often said that the devil is in the details, but I would argue that the devil is much more likely to be found in the complacency of those who believe. the details irrelevant. This case, as you have witnessed, hinges on the minutiae, the slight, almost trivial anomalies that one might dismiss with a careless shrug, yet which unravel the grandest of deceptions. He paused, casting his gaze across the room, fixing each in turn with a sharpness that drew subtle breaths. The murder of Mr. Craven was no haphazard act of passion or greed, but a meticulously orchestrated performance designed to exploit the assumptions and prejudices of us all. Whimsy unfolded the chronology with precision, the false alibi crafted through the ostentatious use of the telegraph, the curious misalignment of the hall clock which misled the timekeepers, the peculiar positioning of the curtains in the library, that muffled crucial sounds, and most tellingly the incongruities in the servants' statements, particularly that of Mrs. Dalrymple. Mrs. Dalrymple's insistence that she heard nothing beyond the soft creak of a door was, I now believe, calculated omission, for the door in question was by design never quite silent, a fact known only to those who frequented this household. It was her knowledge of the door's idiosyncrasy that led her to a convenient silence. The detective turned his attention to Miss Rosamond, who sat with a pale composure. Miss Rosamond's actions, though seemingly those of a distressed niece, bear the hallmark of careful psychological manipulation. The forged letter, the staged arguments, and the timing of her absences were all deliberate. But why? Murmured the vicar. Whimsy's eyes twinkled with the satisfaction of revelation. Jealousy, control, and the desire to erase a scandal that threatened to undo the careful facade of respectability. Mr. Craven was not merely the victim of a quarrel over inheritance. He was silenced because he held knowledge that would have unraveled a far deeper deceit. He stepped closer to the hearth, fingers lightly tracing the edge of the missing silver salver. The salver, missing from the sideboard, was no mere trifle. It was the vessel for the poison, administered in a drink ostensibly meant to soothe. And the absence of the salver was no accident, but a concealment intended to deflect suspicion. As the assembled company digested this, Hargreaves shifted uncomfortably. Whimsy's gaze landed on him. And you, dear Hargreaves, played your part too well in this masquerade of innocence. Yet your knowledge of the estate's secret passages and your familiarity with the victim's routines made you an unwitting accomplice, if not an active participant. The butler's composure broke, a flicker of panic crossing his features, quickly replaced by stiff decorum. "I am but a servant to this house, sir," he murmured. "Indeed," said Whimsy, "and servants are often the keepers of secrets. But it was not your hand that struck the fatal blow, though you carried the weight of silence." Finally, Whimsy addressed the room in a voice that softened but held its edge. "The murderer is Miss Rosamond Barclay, the same one who urged me to investigate, the niece whose grief was as theatrical as it was cold. She sought to erase her uncle's knowledge of her secret liaison, a liaison that, if revealed, would have ruined her prospects and family standing." A gasp rose, and Miss Rosamond's face blanched. "You have no proof," she whispered. "The proof," said Whimsy, producing a small folded note from his breast pocket, "is in the handwriting, the letter you forged, and the poison hidden in the wine you served, disguised beneath the very veneer of familial care." The vicar stepped forwards solemnly. "I pray for your soul, Miss Barclay." Rosamond's resistance faltered, her composure crumbling under the weight of exposure. "It was never meant to be this way," she confessed softly, voice trembling with a mixture of regret and defiance. He threatened everything. Whimsy allowed himself a brief smile, gentle yet unsparing. The cost of secrets is often paid in blood, but justice, however slow, is inexorable. As the police were summoned, and the household began to brace for the inevitable aftermath, Whimsy gathered his coat and hat, preparing to depart. At the door he paused and cast one last glance over his shoulder. One might say, he mused, that in this curious dance of shadows and masks, the guest who changed his name unwittingly unveiled the true masquerade. With that, Lord Peter Wimsey stepped out into the cool night, leaving behind a house forever, altered, and a mystery laid bare by nothing more supernatural than the human heart's dark entanglements.